Hi, my name is Joe Mello, and I'm a reservoir engineer with Netherland, Sewell & Associates. NSAI is a global leader in providing independent petroleum property evaluations for clients around the world, but we also do other kinds of subsurface evaluations, such as natural gas storage and carbon sequestration projects. And that's why I'm here today, to talk to you a little bit about how to select candidate reservoirs for carbon capture and sequestration projects. Before getting into a huge amount of detail on the geologic aspects of sequestration itself, I wanted to take a little bit of a step back and start with the big picture. So a good project has a couple of key elements. It's not just about the geology. This is an example from the Illinois basin, where in Decatur, Illinois, an ethanol plant operated by Archer Daniel Midland started a sequestration project, really two different wells over the past years, and has been quite successful. So I wanted to start with kind of looking at the high level aspects that worked for them there. So in addition to having a strong geologic setting, and we'll get into those aspects a little bit later, they had a good site location where the reservoir was co-located with their emissions on readily accessible land. And they also have a relatively pure CO2 source. Something like ethanol, which comes off of the industrial process essentially as pure CO2, is ready to be dehydrated and compressed and injected underground right away with minimal additional treatment. Whereas more complicated processes like post-combustion carbon capture need more treatment and therefore more capital. So those projects are going to be less advantageous than something like an ethanol plant. So I just wanted to bring that up again just to sort of highlight that while geologic aspects of a sequestration project are really important, they need to be considered in the context of the entire project. And all these aspects need to work together in order to have a successful project. So just to kick things off, I wanted to start with the absolute basics. And if somebody asks, what makes a good sequestration reservoir, a really easy answer is, if it was a good oil and gas reservoir, it would be a good CCS reservoir. Things that sort of define the total pore space you're working with are important. Things like porosity, thickness, and areal extent. Those all define the size of the tank you're working with. Bigger tank, as in higher porosity, a thicker interval, or more areally extensive. All of those characteristics ultimately lead to more carbon that you can store at a given reservoir, and that's attractive. Things like permeability are also important because those define the injectivity you have at a given well. So higher permeability may let you meet your target injection rate with fewer injection wells. So again, that's more of a capital saving side, where you can make a field with lower permeability work, but you may need more injection points in order to meet your target injection rates. And lastly, and most importantly, is the top seal. So you can't have a hydrocarbon accumulation without some sort of working top seal, right? Because oil or gas are more buoyant than water, and they eventually would migrate to the surface. Same thing's true for carbon dioxide, where even in its dense supercritical state, that CO2 is more or is less dense than water, and so eventually it would keep rising and rising and rising back to the atmosphere without a good top seal to hold it in place. So those basic requirements are really essential, and without any of those, you're going to wind up with a reservoir that's of limited utility for carbon storage. On top of all that, there's sort of a side consideration, which is structural complexity. So with structural complexity comes more complications, both from geomechanical perspectives as well as compartmentalization, which may limit you from seeing the entire pore volume you'd like to access with a given injection point. And so that sort of extra complexity is not necessarily desirable when you're looking at a reservoir. So those are the basic concepts, and now let's start talking about some more details. Carbon storage reservoirs can broadly be categorized into two different types. So you can go into a depleted oil and gas reservoir. So that's an interval that formerly held oil and gas that has since been produced and now is at a lower pressure depleted state. You can also inject into saline aquifers. So those are deep underground water reservoirs that are too saline to be usable for drinking water. In the United States, the U.S. Department of Energy has estimated the total storage resources that are available in these two different broad buckets of reservoir types. In the depleted oil, gas, and EOR reservoirs, they estimate anywhere between 186 and 232 billion metric tons are available to be stored. Whereas saline aquifers have anywhere between 2.4 and 21.6 trillion metric tons. And so that's a huge difference. And the bottom line is there's just a lot more storage capacity out there in saline aquifers compared to oil and gas reservoirs. And I should note that, generally today I'm going to be mentioning sort of depleted oil and gas reservoirs, using CO2 and ultimately sequestering it underground in EOR projects, enhanced oil recovery, is pretty well understood and documented. And so I'm not really going to focus on that. I'm going to tend to focus on the pure storage. But you should always keep in mind a lot of the things I'm going to say for depleted oil and gas fields also can apply to EOR reservoirs. So anyway, back to the totals. Saline aquifers are just much more prevalent than depleted oil and gas fields. As anyone who's drilled exploration wells looking for oil can probably tell you, there's a lot of water reservoirs out there. But there are some interesting advantages to depleted oil and gas fields that make them attractive candidates. For one, they're lower pore pressure generally, and so they're a little easier to inject to initially, and they may be less prone to geomechanical issues. But also, there's a lot more data available for those types of fields. So, by virtue of drilling the production wells and producing hydrocarbons in the past, you've got more data in the form of logs, core, probably better seismic shot over those areas, and also just the production totals, the historical production volumes. Using techniques like material balance, we can actually use those production volumes to estimate fairly accurately the ultimate storage potential of a given reservoir. And so those depleted oil and gas fields shouldn't be discounted, even though they're not as generally available, as widely available as saline aquifers. Saline aquifers, I mentioned they're more prevalent. They do exist in a lot of traditional oil and gas areas, like on the U.S. Gulf Coast. But there are also saline aquifers in areas where there's not much current oil and gas activity. So, for example, in Illinois or on the Atlantic Shelf. And so that ultimately can make them more attractive because they'll be closer to potentially to certain sources of CO2 that you'd like to capture and store. So another word on sort of depleted oil and gas fields, I mentioned all that data that they have through logs and cores and things like that. Historic penetrations, while they do provide data, they do have a downside in that every penetration into a top confining layer is a potential anthropogenic leak point, so a man-made pathway for CO2 to escape your storage reservoir. And so that's less desirable, right? You do not want many penetrations into your caprock. Those risks can be mitigated certainly by vetting any wellbores that your CO2 plume is going to come into contact with, and verifying their mechanical integrity to prevent that migration. But if you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds or thousands of penetrations, it just increases the risk that something will slip by and CO2 can migrate out of zone. So, when considering a reservoir for CO2 sequestration, the number of penetrations is something you want to consider. And I just got a couple examples shown here of cases where they've done a good job of that. So the first one is in North Dakota. It's the Red Trail Energy Class 6 permit. I pulled a small map out of their permit application. You can see here this purplish outline. That's their modeled CO2 plume extent at the end of their injection project. And all around you see these dots. A lot of these bluer dots are shallower penetration, sorts of groundwater type wells, but there are some legacy wells in the areas in these orange dots over here. And you can see that their plume, their site has been selected such that none of these legacy wellbores are modeled to actually come into contact with their plume. So they've avoided any historic penetrations in the area. The other thing I wanted to point out, this is in the U.S. Gulf Coast, Gulf of Mexico. These green blocks are offshore blocks that were leased by ExxonMobil in the most recent lease round. And so you can see that the leasing acreage they picked up on the shelf with the intent to sequester carbon, they've done a good job of sort of picking the leases where there's not tons of these old legacy well penetrations around. And so that makes these areas more attractive relative to these other areas because of those lacks of old penetrations. So when selecting reservoirs, another consideration is depth. So CO2 has some unique properties for geologic storage in that at certain temperatures and pressures, CO2, which is a gas at atmospheric conditions, actually becomes a supercritical fluid. And so that's a much denser state compared to a typical gas. And that's sort of illustrated here in this cartoon where you can see it takes up a very large volume as a gas, but as you start moving it to underground pressures at around 3,000 feet, it'll shift over to being a much denser supercritical fluid. That's shown kind of more numerically here on the right, which is comparing CO2 and methane at various depths. And so you can see after it makes that supercritical shift, it becomes much denser. And then while it is still compressible to some extent and does continue to increase density as you get deeper, it's sort of a state of diminishing returns where going deeper and deeper and deeper does not give you huge benefits in extra CO2 density. And so you're not really able to put all that much more CO2 in a given footprint at, say, 10,000 feet versus 8,000 feet. And so then you're really considering other aspects, like when you think about depth, like cost. So deeper reservoirs are going to have more costs in that you're going to have to drill deeper. Maybe you'll have to set an extra set of casing string to get down there. Or, maybe you're going to have to put in more compression on the top sides in order to reach those higher pressures at those deeper intervals. And so it's really a balance when you're selecting a reservoir. If you're fortunate enough to have multiple to choose from, certain reservoirs between that sort of 3,000 to 4,000 feet, once it's supercritical and deeper, you want to balance the CO2 density benefits with the compression and drilling costs. And the other thing to consider, though, is stacked reservoirs, right? So if you're fortunate enough to have multiple stacked reservoirs, you might want to start at the deepest one so you don't have to drill through that CO2 storage plume later on in field life, and you can just move uphole. So, now we've talked about kind of a lot of these basic concepts in a general level. I'm going to spend some time going through a couple of different case studies and talking about specific examples and sort of how they apply to picking a reservoir for sequestration. So to start off, we're going to look at the Insala project, and that's a project that's located in Algeria. It's an industrial scale project where they're separating CO2 from a produced natural gas stream. And that stream contains anywhere from 5 to 10% CO2, depending on which of a collection of natural gas fields it's coming from. And then they inject it on site at Insala. So this reservoir is relatively low permeability. It's about 5 millidarcies. And they're injecting into the same reservoir that they're producing out of, but down dip into the aquifer leg. And in hindsight, it turned out that this aquifer leg wasn't in very good communication with the up-dipped gas producers. And so they tended to cause an increase in pressure around the wells. And so let's look at these. So in the top left, we're looking at a type of data called INSAR, which is a sort of radar measurement of ground deformation. And in this graph, it's a plan view. You can see the injectors in horizontal wells here, KB 503, 502. And the redder colors represent more ground deformation. So it's sort of like blowing up a balloon. These are measured in millimeters, so it's not, huge amounts of ground deformation. But, as you increase pore pressure in the reservoir, that leads to deformation on the surface, and that can be measured with radar. And so that's what we're looking at here. You can see the plume around the number 503 well looks pretty normal. You might expect, sort of an ellipsis type shape. But if you look at around the 502 well, it's got this odd character where there's almost a line right above the well where it doesn't seem to be deforming the reservoir as much. And so what caused that? Well, this other picture here, this cartoon kind of illustrates how that happens and what that means. So this is a case where because of that low permeability and poor communications up dip with the gas production that was going on, it turned out that they ended up increasing the pore pressure quite a bit and had to increase their injection pressures in order to meet their target rates. And so they were injecting at pressures that were high enough to form or perhaps propagate already existing fractures that existed in the reservoir and in the lower caprock or the secondary seal that they had. And what happens is as that fracture propagates above your injection well, the ground above that fracture that's propagating doesn't deform quite as much as the area around it. And so this fracture here, right above the injection well, actually causes this less area of lower deformation up on the surface. And so this sort of illustrates a couple of those characteristics we've already talked about, right? So the desirability of a higher permeability reservoir would have helped because they wouldn't have had to inject at such a high pressure in order to meet their target rates. An extensive aquifer also would have helped because that would allow them to dissipate the pressure a little bit more and again, limit the local buildup of pressure around their injection. But it also illustrates the benefit of a thick caprock, right? So they had about 300 meters of this secondary seal below about 600 meters of what they call their main seal. And despite the sort of fracture propagation in the reservoir and in this sort of first lower seal, there's no indication of any fractures or anything propagating into that thick main seal. And so this is a case where, although they did stop injection, ultimately they did store millions of tons of CO2 successfully underground without migrating it back to the surface. So in that sense, it was a successful project. So there's, I've alluded to this a little bit already, but there's also some geomechanical considerations you want to keep in mind when you're picking a reservoir for CO2 sequestration. So whenever you're injecting into the subsurface, increases in pore pressure can reactivate faults. And more material events can occur when those faults are bigger, which generally also means that when those faults are connected to the crystalline basement. And so when you see large pressure increases against faults that are connected to the basement that are large, you can see material-induced seismicity. And so an example of that would be in Oklahoma when produced water, saltwater disposal into the Arbuckle in the 20-teens, the rates ramped up a bunch and induced seismicity quickly followed. They've since backed off those high rates generally, but it kind of illustrates that, it's something that can be potentially impactful in a storage project, whether you're talking about CO2 or produced water. So for long-term success, because CO2 sequestration is dependent on keeping the CO2 in the ground as well as, injecting for a long period of time to make the project work, candidate reservoirs really need to be less vulnerable to major instances of induced seismicity. Even if small seismic events don't threaten the seal integrity of your caprock, they can still have an impact on the project in the form of public perception, right? Understandably, a lot of people are not going to be super thrilled with earthquakes in their neighborhood. And so induced seismicity as a result of injection needs to be avoided in order to sort of, at the very least, maintain a sort of license to operate in the community. So to illustrate this, I wanted to bring back that Illinois Basin Decatur project I showed on the first slide and talk about its geomechanical considerations. So under the locator map, we're looking at a plan view of the project area, which shows a map of all the induced microseismic events that occurred as a result of the injection. So on this map, those microseismic events are colored by time and sized by magnitude. And I just want to note on the magnitude front, all of these microseismic events were very small. None were felt on the surface. I think the largest one was something like a 1.2 magnitude. So these are really, really small seismic events. You need equipment to detect them, but it still just kind of illustrates the point I'm trying to make. So they're colored by time. The blue dots are all related to injection during the CCS1 time frame. So the first well they drilled as a pilot project. And then all the red dots and orange dots are during the time frame of the CCS2, where they scaled up injection. They injected about twice as much as during CCS1 and operated it for a longer time. So you can see, despite the higher rates and more total injection, longer injection time frame, you can see that there's a lot fewer red dots than blue dots. So the CCS2 well had a much lower instance of induced seismicity than the CCS1 well. And so looking at this log cross-section, we can kind of understand why that might have happened. The CCS1 is over here in the far right. You can see they perforated at the very bottom of the interval. This is the Mount Simon sandstone. And the red line here is the Precambrian basement. And so you can see the Mount Simon is very, very close to that. And so there are faults that extend from the Mount Simon down into this crystalline basement. The CCS2 wells were perforated a little bit higher in the interval. And there's also this blue pick here. And this blue pick is sort of a mudstone baffle that separates the middle Mount Simon from the lower Mount Simon. And so that's the key difference between the CCS1 and the CCS2 from a geomechanical perspective, is that the CCS2 has this mudstone baffle between it and the crystalline basement. And so that baffle limited the amount of pressure increase seen by the faults that sort of penetrated the basement and the lower Mount Simon. So that sort of pressure barrier was enough to dramatically reduce the amount of seismicity that was actually induced by the project. So that was good. Even a little bit of standoff from the basement can help mitigate induced seismicity frequency. So this is just between this and the Insula example previously, which had some ground deformation. This illustrates the importance of geomechanical considerations in CCS projects. Before moving ahead with a sequestration project in a given reservoir, you want to perform a certain level of geomechanical due diligence. So that includes things like identifying pre-existing faults and mapping them, identifying fracture networks in your reservoir and caprock, identifying sort of past seismic events throughout all the recorded history to sort of understand the magnitude of potential seismic events and understand the stress conditions of the reservoir that you're injecting into. So that's the sort of work you want to do up front to make sure that your project is going to be successful from a geomechanical perspective. The next case study I want to talk about is the Schliepner Field in the North Sea, and this is probably one of the best examples of an extremely successful project. This field is again separating CO2 from a produced natural gas stream, and those sorts of projects, you see those a lot, particularly in these early times, because that's something that they kind of have to do anyway, right? So as you produce the CO2, in order to get it to sales quality, you've got to remove that CO2. As you produce natural gas, you've got to remove the CO2 to get it to sales quality. And so, there's not much incremental cost associated with carbon capture because you've already got to separate the carbon from your sales product. So anyway, this project has been going on for 2 decades, injecting almost 1 million tons a year. And it's been quite successful. So they're injecting into this Utsura sand formation here. As you can see, it's shallower than all their producing formations. And this sand is very regionally extensive. So that's something we talked about earlier as being attractive. It is also very thick. So it's hundreds of meters thick, call it 100 kilometers in the east-west direction and hundreds of kilometers in the north-south direction. So it's checking a lot of boxes on our sort of extent or size of the tank criteria, right? It's just a very large formation, and so you can put a lot of CO2 in it and not increase the pore pressure all that much. So that's good from an injectivity standpoint, total storage standpoint, and also related back to the geomechanical considerations we just talked about. Lower pore pressure increases mitigate some of those concerns. It's also really high quality sand. It's good porosity, and it's on the order of 2 darcies. So fantastic permeability as well. So let's look at it a little bit closer. We got a couple things on this slide that I'm going to talk about. First, we've got a log with gamma ray on the right, gamma ray on the left. We've got some time-lapse seismic images here, and then we've got a sort of 3D view of the model. Talking about the log, you can see it's generally a very clean sand, but we've got on these black lines here marked various intervals that are sort of mudstone baffles. And so those mudstones or siltstone baffles, again, they're not hard barriers, but they do provide a little bit of vertical heterogeneity on the reservoir scale. And that's really attractive because those sorts of baffles give secondary areas for the CO2 plume to spread out against as it rises. So if you had a perfectly homogeneous sand with a 2 darcy vertical permeability and you inject into the bottom of that sand, that CO2, because it's buoyant, would generally just rise right up to the top of your reservoir, hit your caprock, and then spread out along that caprock. And that's okay, but it leaves a lot of pore space sort of below that top seal that you're not really utilizing all that well. But because this reservoir's got all these different mudstone baffles on the way up, it gives the CO2 ample opportunity to spread out along the way up before it reaches that ultimate top seal. And you can see that on the induced seismic, where we've got these reflectors which are showing up brighter and brighter over time because the CO2, it's different density than water, so it's changing the seismic character on those reflections. You can see it spreading out at various layers within the sand itself. And that's shown also here in this 3D image. You can see a couple of plumes developing, sort of spreading out over the various mudstone intervals, one of which is shown here in this sort of semi-transparent view. The top seal is completely transparent in this view. The other thing I just kind of want to mention on this project, to harken back to the anthropogenic leak points we discussed kind of towards the beginning, by drilling this well the way they did in a deviated fashion, they've done something clever in that this this penetration of their cap rock occurs all the way over here, right? And so the penetration in the cap rock, even from the very injection well, doesn't actually see the CO2 plume itself. And so that sort of eliminates a potential migration pathway of injected CO2 out of the reservoir. So it's actually a pretty clever injection strategy, if you're concerned about anthropogenic leaking, to mitigate part of that risk by drilling a deviated well. And so, like I said, this was a really successful project, and it illustrates kind of all of the characteristics that you like to see in a reservoir. So changing gears just a little bit, I wanted to mention the SPE, Society of Petroleum Engineers Storage Resources Management System. And it's a little bit a bit of a tangent, but if you bear with me, I'm going to tie it back to reservoir selection eventually. So the Storage Resources Management System of SRMS is really similar to the SPE's PRMS, or Petroleum Resources Management System, that we use for reserve reports all the time. That's really common in the industry, with storage capacity replacing reserves. And it's very similar in sort of logic and methods and language. And so anyone familiar with the PRMS can pretty easily pick up the SRMS and get right to work. And just like reserves, storage capacity has to be commercial in order to meet that definition. And so, you can be commercial by turning a profit with a storage enterprise through sort of storage fees or some sort of government incentive. But one thing I really like about the SRMS is that they sort of also allow commerciality to be met, the hurdle of commerciality to be met, by coupling your CO2 injection project with a revenue and CO2 generating project. So for example, if you've got an ethanol plant that's emitting a bunch of CO2, you don't have to turn a profit storing the CO2 itself, right? You can turn a profit selling your ethanol and storing the CO2 sort of ring-fenced together. And that's really important because it sort of recognizes that going forward, companies may have incentives, sort of ESG pledge types, for example, that would encourage them or incentivize them to sequester their CO2, even if they're not necessarily turning a profit at the act of sequestration itself. And I think that's important because I think that's going to be a bigger and bigger piece of the sequestration incentive total pie going forward. But why am I talking about that during this talk? Well, I bring it up because reservoirs with more data are going to have lower risk and therefore an increasing chance of commerciality. And so for example, a depleted oil and gas reservoir, you're going to have probably more log data, more core data, that production history to do material balance on. So all of that extra information is more likely to give a project a higher categorization early on. So, as projects move forward and it becomes more and more of these projects out there in the universe for investors to choose amongst, using the SRMS as sort of a unified language to benchmark project versus project versus project, I think it's going to grow in importance and commonality. And so when investors are looking at that sort of investment space and which project do they want to pursue, it's something to consider that your depleted oil and gas field may have a higher early categorization compared to a saline aquifer, where perhaps there's one penetration 2 counties away until you drill your categorization well. So more data early on has a potential to impact sort of resource categorization, and that's potentially important for investors going forward. So ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a pretty high level introduction. There's a lot of details that can impact your storage capacity, right? So once you've chosen your reservoir, there's a lot of things that determine how much you're going to ultimately be able to store in a given reservoir at a given site. Things like brine salinity can impact both how much CO2 ultimately dissolves in the water if you're going into a saline aquifer, or even in the connate water in a depleted oil and gas field. The salinity also impacts sort of things like how much salt deposition or solids deposition will occur near your wellbore, so that's a potential injectivity decline. And things like like we talked about for Schlieffner, vertical heterogeneities on the reservoir scale that Schlieffner had, those sort of mudstone continuous layers. Those sorts of vertical heterogeneities can play out at a much smaller scale. So these are like 1 foot cores we're showing that have very small shale breaks versus completely clean sandstone. And those sorts of small scale characterizations of the reservoir rock can also have impacts in sort of how that plume develops and how much of the pore space you end up utilizing. So although there's a lot of different things that can impact how much you can store eventually, but those are smaller orders of magnitude, and so they're not going to probably impact which reservoir you choose to inject into. So there's a lot to consider, a lot more to consider than we're really covering in detail here. But I just want to say that those sort of secondary considerations probably aren't driving the boat. They're going to be more of a something you want to incorporate into your analysis after you've made your selection. And so to wrap it all up, I just wanted to kind of end where we began, setting it all back into context in the sort of characteristics of an ideal project. We talked a lot about the geologic setting today, where, we talked about the reservoir characteristics we want in the injection reservoir itself. We kind of mentioned, stacked reservoirs are really ideal because you have a bunch of targets you can go after over time at a given site. But it all plays a part in a big picture where everything sort of needs to be considered when you're ultimately choosing a project or deciding to pursue a project. And so, site location, CO2 source, local incentives like LCFS incentives in California, all those things matter, and they have to be considered together. And so, as you're considering a project or evaluating projects or screening projects, it's important to keep the big picture in mind and make sure that you're really addressing all of the concerns that make a good project and not focusing on just good CO2 sources, just good site locations, or just good geologic settings. So with that, thanks for tuning in and listening to my talk, and I look forward to talking to everyone later. Bye.